The stale, recycled air of the Northwood High Gymnasium tasted exactly as Lee remembered it. A cloying mix of floor wax, faded perfume, and the ghosts of long-forgotten teenage anxieties. 10 years had passed, but the moment she stepped through the double doors, decorated with garish silver and blue balloons, the decade dissolved into a fine mist. She was 17 again, an invisible girl with her nose buried in books, navigating hallways that felt like hostile territory. Her name is Lee, and she had spent years building a life so far removed from this place that returning felt like visiting a poorly curated museum of her own past failures. A part of her, the disciplined, methodical part forged in unforgiving environments, had advised against this. It was an illogical operation with no clear objective and a high probability of psychological attrition. But Sarah, her one constant friend from that era, had been insistent. "It's about closure, Lee," she'd said over a crackling satellite phone connection a month ago, her voice thin but warm. "You need to see that they're just people, that the world you left behind is so much smaller than the one you've conquered." Conquered. Lee suppressed a dry, mirthless smile. The worlds she navigated now weren't conquered, they were survived. The cavernous room was a cacophony of forced enthusiasm. Faces, softened and lined by a decade of real life, struggled to fit the molds of their youthful memories. Men who were once lean athletes now sported the comfortable paunch of middle management, and women who had been effortlessly cool now wore the weary expressions of mortgages and motherhood. Lee clutched her small, plain black bag, her posture ramrod straight, a stark contrast to the casual slumps and leaning poses of everyone else. She wore a simple, dark blue dress, elegant but unassuming. It was a uniform of sorts designed for blending in for observation. For a moment, no one noticed her. She was a ghost at the feast, watching the reunions unfold. Then a voice, sharp and saccharine, cut through the din. "Oh my God, is that little Lee? I almost didn't recognize you without a stack of textbooks welded to your hands." Jessica, of course. Her blonde hair was a shade brighter, her smile a fraction tighter, but the same predatory glint remained in her eyes. She was flanked by a small court of women who laughed on cue, their expressions a practiced blend of amusement and pity. Lee offered a small, polite nod. "Jessica, you look well." It was a neutral statement, devoid of warmth but also of malice. It was a tactical response, meant to de-escalate to disengage. But Jessica thrived on engagement. "Well, honey, I look fantastic," she preened, smoothing a hand over her sequin dress. "Married an investment banker, 2 kids, a house in the suburbs with a pool, you know, the dream." She looked Lee up and down, her gaze lingering on the simple dress. "And you? Still in town, I assume? Sarah mentioned you were figuring things out." The condescension was a physical force pressing in on Lee. Figuring things out was their euphemism for failure, the polite term for the girl voted, most likely to be forgotten, who had seemingly fulfilled her destiny. Before Lee could formulate another neutral response, a deeper voice joined the fray, a voice that once held the power to make her heart stutter. "Leave her be, Jess. Can't you see she's intimidated?" Her mark for a fleeting, painful year. He stood there, his arm draped possessively around Jessica's waist. He had been the golden boy, the quarterback with the easy charm and the cruel streak he reserved for those he deemed beneath him. He had chosen popularity over her, a betrayal that had been swift and public, cementing her status as an outcast. He looked at her now with the same faint, dismissive pity he'd shown her the day he'd broken up with her in the crowded cafeteria. "Hey, Lee," he said, the name tasting like an afterthought on his tongue. "Didn't expect to see you here. Still working at that little bookstore downtown? Or was it the library?" He didn't wait for an answer, turning to his audience. Lee was always going to do something quiet and intellectual. We all knew that. His words were framed as a compliment, but the tone was a eulogy for a life they had all decided was unremarkable. Lee felt a familiar tightening in her chest, the old defensive reflex to shrink, to disappear. But the years between then and now had been long and hard, and they had taught her a different kind of defense. She met his gaze, her own expression unreadable, and held it. The silence stretched for a moment too long, making him uncomfortable. That was new. She had never been able to make Mark uncomfortable before. She simply said, "Something like that," and her voice was steady, betraying none of the turmoil a younger version of herself would have felt. She wasn't here for them. She was here for Sarah, who was recovering from a serious illness. SS and couldn't make it, and for herself, to prove that this place, these people, had no more power over her. But as she moved away from their circle, the whispers followed her like a trail of smoke, clinging to her back. "Doesn't look like she's done much with her life," one voice murmured. "Sad, really, she was so smart." The irony was a bitter pill. They had no idea what she had done, who she had become. And in that moment, she decided she would let them have their story. For now. The gymnasium was slowly filling up, a sea of name tags and strained smiles. Lee found a small, unoccupied table in the corner, a strategic position that offered a clear view of the exits and the main stage. It was a habit, ingrained and automatic, to assess any new environment for tactical advantages. From her vantage point, she was an anthropologist observing a strange, primitive tribe. They performed rituals of greeting, exchanging inflated accounts of their successes. The currency of the evening was status. The prestigious job title, the exotic vacation, the perfectly curated family photo displayed on a phone screen. Lee had none of these things to offer. Her life wasn't easily condensed into a palatable anecdote. Her successes were measured in lives saved, not dollars earned. Her travels were to places that never made it onto postcards. And her family was a tight-knit unit of men and women bound not by blood, but by shared hardship and unwavering loyalty. As she nursed a glass of water, she scanned the crowd for a familiar, kind face, but Sarah's absence was a palpable void. Without her buffer, Lee was an island, and the tide of the past was rising around her. She could feel the glances, the sideways looks, the pointed whispers. She was a curiosity, a relic from their shared history that didn't quite fit the narrative of triumphant adulthood they were all so desperate to project. They remembered her as the girl who was always leaving conversations, leaving parties early, and finally, leaving town without a word right after graduation. They didn't know she was running toward something, not just away. She had enlisted within a month of getting her diploma, a decision made with a quiet, desperate certainty. It was a path so wildly different from anyone else's that she had never bothered to explain it. How could she describe the profound need for structure, for purpose, for a world where merit was earned through action, not popularity? Her solitude was interrupted by a hesitant figure. It was David, a boy who had been in her advanced chemistry class. He'd been quiet too, with glasses that were always sliding down his nose and a nervous energy that kept him on the fringes of their social ecosystem. He approached her table with a tray of lukewarm appetizers, his smile uncertain. "Lee, it is you, right?" She gave him a genuine, small smile, a rare crack in her stoic facade. "David, it's good to see you." He sat down, relief washing over his features. "You too. I was half expecting to be the only one here who didn't end up a CEO or a supermodel," he joked, his voice low. "This whole thing is a lot." They fell into an easy conversation, a brief respite from the overwhelming social pressure. He was a high school science teacher now, in a neighboring district. He spoke with passion about his students, about the challenge of sparking curiosity in a generation raised on instant gratification. He didn't ask her what she did, not in the probing, judgmental way others had. He just seemed content to connect with someone who also felt like they were speaking a different language from the rest of the room. Their conversation, however, drew unwanted attention. From across the room, Jessica watched them, a smug look on her face. She leaned over and whispered something to Mark, who glanced in their direction, a smirk playing on his lips. He saw the scene and interpreted it through the lens of his own high school worldview. The two class losers, huddled together for comfort. He saw weakness, not a quiet moment of genuine human connection. Lee felt the shift in the room's energy, the renewed focus on her small table. She knew what they were thinking, that she had found her level, that the invisible girl and the nerdy boy had ended up exactly where everyone expected. The band on stage, a mediocre cover band playing hits from a decade ago, finished a song to scattered applause. Then, a man in a slightly too tight suit stepped up to the microphone. It was Kevin, the former student council president, now a local real estate agent with the practiced charm of a man who was always closing a deal. "All right, Northwood High alumni," he boomed, his voice echoing slightly. "It's time for what we've all been waiting for. A little walk down memory lane with our high school superlatives, reunion edition." A groan went through some of the crowd, but it was drowned out by whistles and cheers. This was the main event, the part of the evening dedicated to reinforcing the old hierarchy. Lee felt a cold knot form in her stomach. This was the part Sarah had warned her about, "They'll probably give out some joke awards," she'd said. "Just laugh it off. It doesn't mean anything." But sitting here, under the weight of 100 pairs of eyes, it felt like it meant everything. The awards started predictably. Still, the class clown went to a man who told a terrible joke. Most likely to have a million kids went to a woman who proudly held up a photo of her 5 children. It was harmless, nostalgic fun. But Lee knew her name was a punchline waiting to happen. She could feel the anticipation building, a low hum of collective memory focused on her. Mark and Jessica were whispering again, their heads closed together, their laughter sharp and cruel. They were orchestrating this, she realized. This wasn't just a random walk down memory lane, it was a targeted execution of her social standing. Kevin shuffled his note cards, a theatrical glint in his eye. "And now for a classic," he announced, his voice dripping with mock seriousness. "An award for the person who truly embraced the spirit of quiet contemplation. The one we all knew was destined for a life of a life of peaceful obscurity." He paused for dramatic effect. The room was silent, waiting. Lee felt David shift uncomfortably beside her. He knew what was coming too. "The still most likely to disappear award goes to Lee." The name hung in the air, followed by a wave of laughter. It wasn't just a chuckle. It was a deep, cathartic roar from people who felt secure in their own lives, their own choices. It was the laughter of a pack that had found its scapegoat. On stage, Kevin beckoned for her to come up, but Mark, ever the showman, intercepted the moment. He bounded onto the stage, grabbing the microphone from a surprised Kevin. Hold on," Mark said, his voice smooth and commanding. He held up his hands, playing to the crowd. "I think we can do better than that. Lee didn't just disappear. She was the ghost of Northwood High, remember?" He looked directly at her, his eyes cold. "We used to joke that she'd end up in a dusty old archive somewhere, cataloging forgotten books. It seems we weren't far off." The laughter swelled again, louder this time, more vicious. From the crowd, one of Jessica's friends, shouted, "She still failed." A classmate laughed. The phrase was picked up, a cruel chant that echoed in the vast space of the gymnasium. The room erupted in applause. It was a standing ovation for her failure. Lee sat perfectly still, her hands resting in her lap. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She felt a strange, icy calm descend over her. It was the same feeling she got in moments of extreme danger, a clarity that pushed all emotion aside, leaving only pure, focused observation. She watched them all, Mark, basking in the spotlight, his ego inflated by their shared cruelty. Jessica, her face alight with malicious glee. The rows of faces, laughing and clapping, their features distorted by the poor lighting. They were celebrating a narrative they had written for her, a story of a quiet girl who never amounted to anything. They were so sure of their judgment, so confident in their assessment of her worth. Her lack of reaction seemed to disarm them. The applause faltered, the laughter dying down into an awkward silence as they waited for her to break. But she wouldn't give them the satisfaction. She simply met Mark's gaze from across the room, her expression a blank slate. In her mind, she was miles away, in a place where success wasn't measured by applause, but by the quiet hum of a helicopter arriving just in time, by the relieved sob of a family pulled from rubble, by the steady beat of a heart that was still beating because of a decision she had made under unimaginable pressure. This gymnasium, this reunion, it was just a simulation. It wasn't real. The real world was waiting for her outside these walls. She would endure this, and then she would leave, and they would all fade back into the insignificance they had tried to assign to her. The silence on stage became awkward. Mark, having expected tears or a hasty retreat, seemed unsure how to proceed. He fumbled with the microphone, his victory feeling hollow without her visible defeat. He was about to make another joke, to try and recapture the crowd's energy, when something unexpected happened. The main lights in the gymnasium suddenly dimmed, plunging the room into a murky twilight. The only light came from the stage, but even that flickered and then softened, shifting from a harsh white to a single, focused, respectful spotlight that settled not on the stage, but on the corner table where Lee was sitting. A collective gasp rippled through the audience. The band stopped playing mid-chord. The chatter ceased. There was a profound, instantaneous silence, the kind that feels heavy and absolute. Then the lights dimmed. A new figure wow. Ked onto the stage from the side, a woman in a professional black pantsuit holding a tablet. She wasn't one of the alumni. She had an air of authority and purpose that was completely out of place at this gaudy, nostalgic event. She walked to the center of the stage, gently taking the microphone from a stunned Mark, who stepped back as if he'd been dismissed by a superior officer. The woman tapped the microphone once, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent room. "Good evening," she began, her voice crisp and clear, devoid of the forced bonhomie of the previous speakers. "My apologies for the interruption. My name is Alina, and I'm a representative from the governor's office. We were made aware that a distinguished resident of this state would be in attendance here tonight, and we felt it was a matter of public importance to acknowledge her." A confused murmur spread through the crowd. Who could she possibly be talking about? They scanned the room, looking at the local business owners, the doctors, the lawyers. Mark's chest puffed out slightly, a flicker of hope in his eyes that this was somehow about him, a surprise recognition for his company's recent expansion. Jessica was already composing a look of wifely pride. "The woman on stage," Alina continued, her gaze sweeping over the audience before it landed with unmistakable precision on Lee. 10 years ago, a young woman graduated from this high school. By all accounts, she was quiet, diligent, and largely unnoticed. She didn't stay here to build a life that you would all recognize. She didn't go to a prestigious university or start a career in a comfortable office. She chose a different path, a harder path. The spotlight on Lee's table seemed to intensify. People were turning in their seats, their faces a mixture of confusion and dawning disbelief. David, sitting beside her, looked at her with wide, questioning eyes. Lee remained perfectly still, her expression unchanging, but inside her heart was hammering against her ribs. This wasn't supposed to happen. Her work, her life, was built on a foundation of anonymity. To be seen, truly seen here in this place of all places, was profoundly disorienting. Alina looked down at her tablet, as if to read from an official citation. She chose a path of service, a path that took her far from home, to some of the most dangerous and unforgiving places on Earth. While her peers were climbing corporate ladders, she was climbing mountains on rescue missions. While they were negotiating contracts, she was negotiating for the lives of hostages. While they were building families, she was rebuilding communities shattered by natural disasters. Every word was a stone dropped into the silent pool of the gymnasium. The ripples of shock were visible on every face. The story being told was so utterly alien to the one they had all agreed upon for the last hour. This couldn't be Lee, the quiet, failed girl from the library. It didn't make sense. Mark's smug expression had dissolved, replaced by a slack-jawed bewilderment. Jessica's face was pale, the triumphant glitter in her eyes extinguished. Alina looked up from the tablet, her eyes locking with Lee's once more. The authority in her voice was now tinged with a deep, genuine respect that commanded the attention of every single person in the room. "We are not here tonight to give out a high school superlative," she said, her tone sharp, a clear rebuke of the mockery that had just transpired. "We are here to honor a genuine hero." She paused, letting the weight of the word hero settle into the thick, uncomfortable silence. The crowd was frozen, a tableau of disbelief. The people at the tables closest to Lee were slowly, hesitantly turning to look at her, their expressions shifting from condescension to utter confusion. It was as if they were seeing her for the first time, the image of the mousy, forgettable girl shattering before their eyes, being replaced by something they couldn't comprehend. The woman on stage, Alina, raised her voice slightly, ensuring it carried to every corner of the now silent gymnasium. "For acts of extraordinary bravery during the international relief efforts following the Tarian earthquake 2 years ago, for leading a team under extreme duress to rescue 17 civilians trapped in a collapsed building, an action for which she was awarded the Soldier's Medal. For her strategic command during the Operation Safe Harbor evacuation, which saw over 300 displaced persons move to safety during a rapidly escalating conflict. And for a career marked by selfless dedication, courage, and a commitment to protecting others, a career that has been recognized with numerous commendations, both domestic and from allied nations." Alina paused, taking a breath, letting the litany of accomplishments sink in. The silence in the room was no longer just quiet, it was heavy, suffocating. It was the sound of a decade of assumptions, of casual cruelty. Why and willful ignorance, collapsing under the weight of an undeniable truth. The air crackled with a tension that was almost unbearable. Every eye was now fixed on Lee, who had not moved a muscle. She felt like an exhibit in a museum, her life laid bare under the glare of the spotlight. She could see the faces in the crowd clearly now. The disbelief was morphing into something else, awe in some, shame in others. Mark looked as if he had been physically struck. His face was ashen, his mouth slightly agape. The golden boy, the king of their small high school pond, was suddenly, painfully aware of how small that pond truly was. His mockery, his jokes about her quiet life, now seemed not just cruel but preposterously absurd. Jessica stood beside him, her perfectly applied mask of superiority cracking. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, were fixed on Lee, a toxic cocktail of envy and humiliation brewing within them. The life she had flaunted, the banker husband, the house with the pool, suddenly felt trivial, a cheap imitation of success compared to the substance of the life Lee had actually lived. Alina's voice cut through the stunned silence once more, reaching its crescendo. "It is my distinct honor on behalf of the governor and a grateful nation to ask for your attention and respect for one of your own." She turned her body fully towards Lee, her posture a clear sign of deference. The spotlight seemed to burn even brighter. Then came the words that would echo in that gymnasium, in the minds of everyone present, for years to come. The host said, "Major Lee, your presence is requested." The title hung in the air, electric and irrefutable. Major Lee. It was a formal declaration, a title earned through years of sacrifice and service, a rank that carried a weight of responsibility they couldn't possibly fathom. It recontextualized everything they thought they knew about her. The quiet girl wasn't shy, she was disciplined. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was strength. Her disappearance wasn't a failure, it was a deployment. In that single moment, Lee was no longer the ghost of Northwood High. She was a commanding officer in the United States Armed Forces. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. MYX's smile vanished. It didn't just vanish, it was wiped clean from his face, replaced by a pallor of pure, unadulterated shock. His entire body went rigid, as if bracing for an impact that had already landed. The man who had stood on that stage just moments before, basking in the cheap glory of mocking her, was now utterly diminished, exposed as a petty bully in the presence of genuine greatness. The laughter, the applause, the jeers, it all curdled into a collective, burning shame that swept through the room like a fire. Every table fell silent. Not a single person spoke. No one coughed. No one even seemed to breathe. The only sound was the faint, apologetic hum of the gymnasium's ventilation system. The silence was a verdict, a judgment on their collective behavior. It was an acknowledgement of their profound, spectacular error. Alina, her duty done, gestured respectfully towards Lee and then, with a quiet dignity that contrasted sharply with the garishness of the event, she walked off the stage, leaving a vacuum of stunned silence in her wake. The spotlight remained on Lee, a solitary beacon in the dim room. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. The entire reunion was frozen in a state of suspended animation, waiting for her reaction. She finally moved. Slowly, with the deliberate grace of someone in complete control of her body and her emotions, she placed her napkin on the table and rose to her feet. She looked not at the stage, not at the crowd, but at David, who was staring at her as if she had just sprouted wings. She gave him another small, reassuring smile, a silent thank you for his kindness in a hostile room. Then she turned to face the hundreds of stunned faces. She didn't look angry. She didn't look triumphant. Her expression was calm, composed, perhaps a little weary. It was the face of someone who had seen far worse things than a room full of high school bullies. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, not of gratitude, but of acknowledgement. A simple, dignified closing to a chapter she had never intended to reopen. Then, without a word, she turned and began to walk towards the exit. The sound of her heels clicking on the polished floor was the only sound in the cavernous room. Each step was a deliberate, measured beat, a slow drum counting down the end of their reign. Her path took her directly past the table where Jessica and her friends were seated. As she approached, they physically shrank back in their chairs, unable to meet her gaze. Jessica, the queen bee, looked small and insignificant, her sequined dress suddenly looking cheap and gaudy. She stared down at her hands, her face flushed with a deep, blotchy red. Lee walked past without a single glance in their direction. They were no longer relevant. Her next obstacle was the stage, where Mark still stood, frozen like a statue. He seemed to snap out of his trance as she drew near, and he took a clumsy step forward, his hand half raised as if to stop her. "Lee, he stammered, his voice hoarse, unrecognizable. "I didn't know." The words were a pathetic excuse, an admission of his own profound ignorance. Lee stopped for a single, fleeting moment. She finally looked at him, her gaze direct and penetrating. There was no hatred in her eyes, no anger. There was something far worse, pity. She saw him for exactly what he was, a man who had never grown beyond the high school hallways, a man whose sense of self was built on the fragile foundation of others' perceived failures. She didn't need to say a word. Her silence was more damning than any accusation. She simply held his gaze for a second longer, letting him see the vast, unbridgeable chasm that had opened up between them, and then she continued on her way. The spell broke as she reached the double doors at the far end of the gym. A single person began to clap. It was David. He was on his feet, his applause tentative at first, then growing louder, more confident. Then another person joined in, and another. It wasn't the boisterous, mocking applause from before. This was different. It was hesitant, scattered, and deeply, deeply respectful. It was the sound of an apology. But Lee didn't turn back. She didn't need their applause any more than she had needed their scorn. She pushed open the doors and stepped out into the cool, quiet night, leaving the wreckage of their reunion and her own past behind her for good. The cool night air was a welcome shock to her senses, clean and sharp after the stale atmosphere of the gymnasium. Lee stood on the steps for a moment, letting the silence of the school parking lot wash over her. The distant sound of the tentative, awkward applause faded as the heavy doors swung shut behind her. She took a deep breath, and then another, her training kicking in, regulating her heartbeat, calming the adrenaline that had surged through her veins. It wasn't a feeling of triumph, not exactly. It was more complex than that. It was a profound sense of release, the severing of a final, lingering thread that had tied her to this place, to the ghost of the girl she used to be. Her phone buzzed in her small bag. She pulled it out. It was a text from Sarah. "Elena just called me, said it went well. Are you okay?" Lee smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached her eyes. She typed back a simple reply, "Objective complete, heading back to base." She walked across the sparsely lit parking lot toward her modest, practical car. A figure hurried out of the gym doors behind her. "Lee, wait!" It was David. He jogged to catch up with her, looking slightly out of breath. Wow," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "I don't even know what to say." "You don't have to say anything, David," she replied, her voice soft. "It was good to see you." "You too," he said earnestly. "Listen, I just wanted to say I'm sorry for them. For all of it back then, we were kids, we were idiots." "We were," she agreed, offering him a small nod of absolution. "But we're not anymore. You're a teacher. You're shaping the next generation. That's important work." His face lit up with a shy pride. "Thanks, Lee. Hey, Major Lee." He tested the title out, a look of awe on his face. "It suits you." Before she could respond, another set of footsteps, heavier and more desperate, echoed behind them. Mark was practically running towards them, his tie loosened, his face pale and slick with sweat under the parking lot lights. He skidded to a halt a few feet away, his chest heaving. "Lee, please," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "You can't just leave, we need to talk." Lee's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. She turned to David. "It was really good seeing you again. Take care of yourself." It was a clear dismissal. David got the message, giving Mark a wary look before nodding at Lee. "You too, Major." He turned and walked away, leaving her alone with the man who had authored so much of her past pain. "What is there to talk about, Mark?" Lee asked, her tone flat and devoid of emotion. She didn't give him the satisfaction of anger, she gave him nothing. "Everything," he exclaimed, taking a step closer. She didn't flinch, didn't retreat. Her stillness was a wall he couldn't breach. "I was an idiot, a complete and utter fool. I had no idea, if I had known what you were doing, who you were." "Who I was?" she interrupted, her voice dangerously quiet. "You knew who I was, Mark. I was the girl you dated for a year, the girl you shared secrets with, the girl who was smart and loyal and cared about you. That wasn't enough. You wanted someone who made you look good, someone who was popular. You made your choice." The simple, unvarnished truth of her words seemed to deflate him, all his luster, his carefully constructed confidence, evaporated, leaving him exposed and pathetic. "It was high school," he whispered, as if that explained everything. "It was a stupid game. I was following a stupid script." "And you're still following it," she countered, her gaze unwavering. "Tonight wasn't about high school, Mark. It was about you, a grown man, needing to feel powerful by putting someone else down. You saw me, and you saw an easy target. The same easy target I was 10 years ago. The only thing that's changed is that you got the story wrong." He flinched as if she'd struck him. He ran a hand through his hair, his composure completely gone. What can I do to make it right? He asked, his voice thick with desperation. He wasn't just apologizing for his cruelty, he was terrified of the social repercussions. He could already imagine the whispers, the stories spreading through their town. Mark, the big shot, who tried to humiliate a decorated war hero. His reputation, the very thing he had sacrificed her for, was now in jeopardy. Lee looked at him for a long moment, a flicker of the old sadness passing through her. She was sad for the boy he had been and for the man he had failed to become. There's nothing to make right, she said finally, her voice softening almost imperceptibly. Your actions and their consequences are your own. They have nothing to do with me anymore. With that, she turned her back on him, got into her car, and started the engine. She didn't look in the rear-view mirror as she pulled out of the Northwood High parking lot for the last time. She didn't see him standing there, alone under the flickering lights, a ghost of his own past. She didn't see Jessica emerge from the gym, her face a mask of fury and shame, and start yelling at him. She didn't see any of it because she was already looking forward, down the long, open road, toward the real, meaningful life she had built for herself, a life where their judgment could no longer reach her. The closure Sarah had spoken of wasn't about seeing that they were just people. It was about realizing, with absolute certainty, that she had finally, truly, left them all behind.